All right, scholars, let's pick up from where we left off. So, the devastation of guerrilla warfare. It's important to understand that when we talk about guerrilla warfare, it's more than just one thing which impacts America's service. And it's one of the reasons why this strategy is so disastrously effective against large armies, not only in the case of the United States, but in the case of almost every other country that's ever had to experience it. So that is something to keep in mind. When we discuss the Vietnam War, it's important to understand that it created a paranoia. In fact, you could even argue it almost acted akin to gaslighting. Allow me to explain. So, the problem is in typical warfare, what we call conventional warfare, there is a very clear line between a non combatant and a combatant, i.e., between a member of an enemy military who a soldier is allowed to engage with, kill, et cetera, all that which comes with war. And then there is civilians who are not supposed to be harmed. Now, again, I say combatant or non combatant because obviously, if you're fighting a terrorist group, they're combatants, although we may not technically call them soldiers as they are, in effect, international criminals, but I digress. So, when we look at this, when we look at this scenario, what this does is it blurs that line. The guerrilla warfare, the partisan warfare blurs that line. We have a scenario where, as one U.S. soldier at the time put it, the man who waved at you from his field in the day would be the one out hunting you with a gun at night. So, for the American servicemen over in Vietnam, this is complicating because you almost would feel as if you were losing control of reality, right? You don't know, right? You march into a city, you march into not a city, but a small town, and there's all these nice locals, and they're welcoming you and whatnot, and you want to believe, okay, these are non-threatening locals, but for all you know, come the next night, half the town is out there in the woods with AK-47s looking to murder you and the other people who you're with. So it's very challenging. And as a result of this really, one, has a devastating psychological effect on an enemy, which is the whole point of it. And it also puts the US in a really difficult position. If the US does what typical armies do in a conventional war, which is to really minimize your impact on the civilian population, i.e., avoid civilian settlements that aren't of strategic value, try to do as little harm to the civilian population as possible, then in many cases, this would mean ignoring Viet Cong threats who could hide among the civilian population until the US was gone or had their guard down, and then they'd pop up again. Or you could do the other thing, which would be to, okay, this village is full of enemies. Let's target it as if it's an enemy base camp, because that's effectively what it is. And many made that call. So we had issues of bombing villages that were Viet Cong aligned, setting fire to structures and villages that were aligned or giving shelter to the Viet Cong. And this was more or less legitimate in a sense, in that it was done out of military necessity. This isn't ethnic cleansing or something like that, where it's done without any military necessity. But what we see happen, though, is this did clear out Viet Cong, but it galvanized national international criticism of the war. So you have war reporters, and they're showing footage of huts on fire, of little children running out in the street because their parents got got killed in a bomb explosion, civilians being interrogated as if they are potential threats. And it is, the American public is not used to this, right? These are the things we would get on our enemies for doing. And yet there's news footage of us doing those things. And that doesn't sit well with the American public. And it doesn't sit well with the international public either. In fact, one of the big casualties of the war is America's international image, that image of America as the sort of beacon of liberty that we helped to cultivate by beating the Axis in World War II takes a major hit during this particular episode of the Cold War. And this is all in addition to the fact that more American soldiers are getting killed by these insurgents than by your average rank and file North Vietnamese soldier, which is quite interesting. So you would think that being a president during a losing war would be the absolute worst thing that could happen to you, but you'd be wrong, at least if you're Richard Nixon. See, Richard Nixon was in the unenviable position that midway through his job of leading the nation through the Vietnam War, he had a re-election campaign like you do. And in 1972, the Democratic Party headquarters in D.C. at the Watergate Hotel was broken into by a pair of burglars. Okay, it's not so bad. Burglars break into things. It's kind of what they do. Burglars burgle. But these burglars weren't interested in stealing things. No. They attempted to place an illegal wiretap, i.e. an illegal recording device placed in or on a phone designed to illicitly record telephone conversations. And it was perpetrated by members of the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. Now, Nixon denied any connection to the break-in on his, political rivals. And he was reelected nonetheless in November of 1972. In hopes of burying the rumors, Mr. Richard M. Nixon famously issued this public speech. It is entitled, "I'm Not a Crook," and I'm going to let you all take a listen to it.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Yes, sir.
A lovely sentiment. I think we'd all agree. A beautiful sentiment, perhaps. There's just a small, teensy-weensy little problem with this. And that problem is Richard M. Nixon certainly was a crook. You don't get a nickname like, well, I'm not going to repeat his name because it's not, some people may not feel it's 100% appropriate, but it's tricky, and then something which rhymes with it. Anywho, so the burglars who did their burgling were actually paid off. Now, again, Republicans and Democrats continue to debate to this day what exactly happened. There are some Republicans who will tell you that Richard Nixon had no idea what the burglars were doing, that someone else in his campaign staff made the call to put a wiretap in the Watergate Hotel in hopes of getting dirt on what the Democrats knew and what their election strategy was. Others insist absolutely not. Nixon was a ruthless man. He likely knew full well what was going on. Whichever version you choose to believe, I'm not going to fault you here, and I doubt the AP exam will fault you either. But what cannot be contested is what happened next. Once Nixon understood that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, would be carrying out a full investigation into what happened in Watergate, he immediately sprung to cover up what had happened in hopes of distancing himself. And so he ordered the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to obstruct an FBI investigation. As I was saying, the issue is that this obstruction is an illegal act. It is illegal for an official within the U.S. government to try and prevent an investigative body of the US government or any sort of law enforcement from doing their job. And so that is what's called obstruction of justice. And this falls under the banner of what we would call high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, eventually, no secret ever stays secret for long. Investigative journalists working for the Washington Post were able to uncover Nixon's role in covering up the break-in. When Congress found out, they were very interested in knowing basically just how far did this go. Basically, to know two things. One, what did Nixon know and when did he know it? And how much did what he knew impact what he did? So in other words, his move to stop the investigation into Watergate, was this done simply to shield his campaign, or was it done to shield himself from wrongdoing? It was already a problem, no matter which one it was, but it affects the kind of problem, right? Remember, it is a criminal issue for a president to do this, even if it's not for self-gain, right? If I'm the president and I'm sympathetic to a particular organization and they rioted, and I try to use my executive power to stop law enforcement from investigating the riot, that's still obstruction of justice, as far as I understand it. Even if it got me nothing, even if I'm doing this totally altruistically. But then it's another issue if, no, I did the crime. If I ordered somebody to do something that was already illegal, and then I use my official position to try and stop law enforcement from uncovering my involvement, that's an additional problem. So one of the things that comes out at this point is Nixon's audio tapes, what are sometimes called the Watergate tapes. So let's talk about them because they've kind of become part of America's myth and lore. So what are they? So when Richard Nixon first began his time as president, he was asked, or he was asked, but he was in conversation with Lyndon B. Johnson, the gentleman who had the job prior to him. It's typical for presidents when there's about to be a changing of the official to sit down and for the fellow leaving the position to give the fellow entering the position a little bit of advice. And Nixon's advice that he received from Johnson was record everything. Why? See, Lyndon B. Johnson, I'm getting my Johnsons confused now. Lyndon B. Johnson was planning on writing a book on his time as president, and he was deeply concerned that after so many years in the office, that he would not be able to remember many of the finer details of conversations he'd had, conversations he wanted to include in his book, in his memoir. And so his advice to Nixon was record everything, because once you're no longer president, you may well want those recorded conversations. And Nixon thought that was a wonderful idea. And so he recorded every conversation in the room, every phone conversation that he had. And so because of this, when Congress heard there was a dispute about Nixon, their first instinct was, well, then give us the tapes. We want to subpoena the tapes so that we can listen to them. And Nixon initially refused. Now you may be wondering, well, how do you look, on what grounds? And the answer was what's called executive privilege. See, as the president of the United States, as the chief law enforcement officer, and as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States of America, you are going to be entitled to secrets. There are certain things in this world that are for president's eyes only, right? These may involve intelligence gathering from the Central Intelligence Agency, updates from the Pentagon, specific conversations with high-ranking U.S. military personnel, maybe even a couple of conversations with foreign diplomats that are very strictly meant as you as the president are one of the few people with the security clearance to know this. Not every senator, not every representative, not every congressional staffer, the various secretaries and aides that assist members of Congress with their work are necessarily entitled to know all of that information. So he's saying, look, there are things in these tapes that you all do not have the security clearance to know. And therefore, I am not going to be handing them over. And so the issue came before a judge, and the judge's position was no. While it's fully acknowledged that, yes, the president may have certain national security interest based things which are to be kept secret, that's not a blanket permission for the president to hide any and all records from their time in office. And so the end result was they said, look, you have got to hand over the tapes, although there are rumors that some minutes of the tapes are missing. So needless to say, Nixon was impeached for obstruction of justice. Now, what happened next is largely up to debate. What happened next is largely a matter of debate. And depending on your own particular partisan persuasion, you may or may not believe one of two accounts on this matter. So first of all, Nixon resigned the next day. Now, why he resigned is debated. Many Republicans believe that it was done as a gesture of honor. Many of them believe that Nixon was covering more or less for his underlings. And so kind of realizing that the jig was up and not wanting to put the country through the turmoil of a second, of a whole impeachment trial and all the trouble that would come with that, he decided to kind of spare the office that indignity, spare his party that trouble, and just bow out. Democrats have a very different perception of the event. They argue, look, he knew his goose was cooked. He knew that this was going to be a conviction. He was going to be expelled from office, and that it was probably going to be followed up by formal criminal charges. And so he decided to cut and run. In fact, many believe that he may well have had a contingency plan. And what I mean by that is, see, what happened next in very short order was that no sooner did Nixon resign as president than Gerald Ford, Nixon's very recently appointed vice president, because his first vice president was dismissed after Watergate began and Gerald Ford came on. No sooner did Nixon leave and Gerald Ford, Nixon's successor, uses the ability of the presidential pardon to pardon Nixon for any and all offenses he committed, meaning that he is pardoned from the obstruction charge. And that pardon meant that he could not be charged. He could not face penalties for that as a civilian. And many people wondered whether this was maybe part of the dance. Look, I'll resign, then my vice president will pardon me, and I won't get in any kind of trouble. So whether he did it to spare the country or spare his own skin, we'll never know. But that's what happened. America soon found itself in a new problem under a new president. Not long thereafter would come the election of Jimmy Carter. And Carter's administration would be plagued by a couple of problems. And one of the biggest was the Arab oil embargo. America's continued support for the nation of Israel had put the United States in poor terms with other Arab nations. Most Arab nations had resented the fact that the territory, so the land that we call Israel and sometimes call Palestine, had for a long period of time been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire fell after World War I, the land was controlled by the British, who simultaneously promised it to Jewish settlers and to Arabs and Palestinians. So the land was double promised. After the end of World War II, there were numerous Jewish refugees in Europe. Their homes had either been destroyed by warfare while they were still in concentration camps, or else many of the local communities had threatened to kill them if they ever returned. So many Jewish people in Europe needed a fresh start. And the nation of Israel became that fresh start for them in 1947. And from the day Britain granted Israel independence, its rivals, the other Arab nations, one, refused to accept it, and B, began attacks. Now, what happens over these years is continuing to have ramifications. Britain, for some reason, at the time in this part of the Cold War, nations of the world thought it was a really good idea to split countries in half and thought it was an even better idea to split cities into pieces. Don't ask me why this was a trend in geopolitics, but it's something to ask your poli-sci professor whenever you get one. So what happened when this all took place was Israel, what was then Israel, is about half of what's now Israel, with the city of Jerusalem being split in half. So there was originally supposed to be an Israel and a Palestine, with Israel and Palestine splitting custody of the city of Jerusalem. When Israel's Arab neighbors attacked back in the late 40s, early 50s, many of these rival nations pushed through Palestine to get at Israel. Israel pushed them back and pushed their armies so far back, Israeli forces occupied Palestine all the way up to what's sometimes called the West Bank of the River Jordan. And from then on, Israel has kind of continued to occupy that land and has to some extent laid claim on it, which has continued to upset international relations, leaving Palestine as a kind of is it, isn't it kind of a question. Officially, that land is Israeli. Officially, Jerusalem is under Israeli rule, although this factor is disputed in much of the Middle East and remained disputed for many decades. So, with that being done, many of the Arab nations were hesitant to even recognize Israel's existence. And America's continued support of Israel through the 70s had raised much ire. So Arab nations tended to dominate what was called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, OPEC is not a theological union, right? It's not a jihadist organization. It's not a Muslim-only organization, but Arab nations of the Middle East tended to dominate that league because of the natural oil, that's there. Now, other countries are members. I believe Venezuela is a member, and I believe Russia is also a member. I'm not certain if the Soviets were a member of OPEC at the time, though, but I'm digressing. Anyhow, OPEC would go on to shut down oil shipments to the U.S. This was done both in an effort to punish the United States for its support of Israel, as well as to raise oil prices, right? Supply and demand. By decreasing the supply relative to the demand, they could up the price. So it was a really good deal for OPEC, the Arab and non-Arab members of OPEC, and for the Middle Eastern members of OPEC, it was kind of a double deal. They got to both punish the US and Israel, and they also got to get more money. I mean, that's right. That's amazing, right? That's a really good deal for them. So, what did this mean? The oil crisis, shortage of oil in the United States. What happened? All manner of heck broke loose. One, factories decreased production. Many factories ran on petroleum products, whether it was crude oil, whether it was diesel oil, whether it was gasoline. And as a result of that, they decreased production. And since oil was also used to generate electricity, many large electric-based companies also found themselves facing increased operational costs. Now, gasoline was rationed in the US. For example, if you were a motorist, you could only receive gallons of gasoline on certain days based on whether you're given A or a B as a form of rationing. And gas purchases were limited, right? We see the sign up above where it says sales limited to 10 gallons of gas per customer. President Carter would even impose a national speed limit of 55 miles an hour in an effort to preserve gas. So what did this mean? Beyond just gas being expensive, this would entirely upend the US auto industry. So this is the end of the large, inefficient automobiles of the 50s and 60s, right? In case you're wondering, what happened to these big, giant, chrome-covered, thinned-out designs? And the answer basically is the oil crisis killed them. See, in the 50s and 60s, gas was cheap. And because gasoline was cheap, people really didn't think about gas consumption that much. When gas costs you literally a few cents, literal pocket change, you don't think too hard about how much gas you use to do anything. Once gasoline was becoming expensive and less readily available, more Americans began thinking about, what? I want a car that uses less gasoline. And so this is where we see the rise of smaller fuel-efficient cars. When we see these little hatchbacks, little 4-cylinder engines, things like that. Like that's why 8 cylinders became less common. 6 and 8 cylinders became less common, with 6 and 4 cylinders becoming more or less market standard in a lot of sedans. This is also the beginning of a lot of other things. One, we see more interest in less gas guzzling cars, which leads to an interest in imports. For example, Toyota, which is nowadays a major juggernaut in the American market. There are some models of Toyotas, such as their pickup trucks, that Toyota probably sells more of in the United States than they do in Japan. And yet, this relationship really comes out of the fact that Americans first were interested in Toyotas back in the oil embargo, because suddenly these foreign cars, in this case, Japanese-made cars that were much more fuel efficient, became interesting to us. Before that, Toyotas would have been too small to really have been of much interest to the average person. But then all of a sudden, with the oil crisis, Americans wanted more fuel-efficient cars. German Volkswagens became very popular during this time. It also would lead American manufacturers to change their own standards, right? So American cars also got smaller. This is why we also see the rise of things like hatchbacks. One way of making the cars more fuel efficient was making them lighter. An engine uses less fuel if there's less to drag. So this is where we see the development of these smaller cars. Now, we also see discussions of alternative fuel sources. This is where America starts to realize we really are dependent on a foreign source of energy, and that's not okay. Now, green energy is still a long way off at this point, so most of the focus is on coal or nuclear power. Ending Vietnam. So the war ended April 30th, 1975. As you already know, America and South Vietnam lost. America would be left with a lot of scars from this. And many South Vietnamese fled, many of them heading to the United States. The South Vietnamese community is also among one of the most conservative minorities in America, largely for this reason. In fact, a few of you, if you were really attentive to detail, may have noticed when you looked at the flags, some of the folks were flying during the insurrection on the Capitol, there were South Vietnamese banners hidden among the multitude of other more offensive slogans. Now, soldiers were returned home, where many of them received a rather less than warm welcome from a country that was disgusted with the war and sometimes didn't quite have the mental maturity to separate the veteran from the conflict. Many never returned home. Many young men lost their lives in the jungles of Vietnam. Others went missing in action, their fate unknown to this day. Are they still prisoners of war held captive by now it would be communist Vietnam. There's only one Vietnam now. Were they killed in action and we simply haven't found their remains? Did they flee? We don't know. Others had been prisoners of war, being tortured in various ways by the Vietnamese. One of the most famous was Hanoi. So, repercussions of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War would ultimately shape U.S. politics and U.S. military decisions. So, according to some political scientists, the modern political divide in America has its roots in Vietnam. That's one. Two, U.S. military recruitment policy would become a major effort. See, the U.S. realized really quickly after Vietnam that America was not happy with a war that involved conscription, i.e., a great number of Americans, their biggest objection to the war in Vietnam was that they didn't personally want to go fight in it. And so one strategy the US kind of learned was we need an army that isn't going to be conscripted. And this is why we see such an effort put into American, how can we put this, recruitment efforts. The American military now spends thousands of dollars, $100,000 on commercials, on grants and various pay advancements for enlisting, enlistment bonuses of different kinds. We see Army recruiters that go to schools, go to universities, trying to get as many people to sign up for the military. And part of the reason for this is it's easier for the American government to do what it needs to do in a scenario where everyone is enlisted and signed up for it, rather than having a smaller peacetime army and then scrambling to draft people and dealing with resistance to the draft. So, two, the U.S. desire to punish the Soviet Union. See, while the Soviets didn't directly fight in Vietnam, they supplied material support. They're the ones who gave the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong AK-47s and other AK-type weapons. They provided anti-tank weapons and anti-helicopter weapons. They gave support to these factions. And the U.S. largely laid the desolation of their forces in Vietnam at the feet of the Soviets. Without the Soviet equipment, it's very likely that the U.S. would have prevailed. And so, as a result of that, America was determined to punish the Soviets, right? We didn't just want to beat the Soviets anymore just because they were communists. We wanted to punish them for what they had put our nation through as a result of Vietnam. Finally, we have damage to American international reputation. Images of burning Vietnamese huts, of screaming children as their parents' homes were bombed, of soldiers interrogating civilians in stress positions, these found their way to news stations and newspapers, not only in America, but the world over. And many would judge the United States for it. And so the image of America as the sort of savior of Europe that had been so popular after World War II, both because of our defeat of the Nazis together with things like, the Marshall Plan, that goodwill begins to wane as a result of the images coming out of Vietnam. Now, I mentioned about the modern political divide, so allow me to explain this a little bit. According to some political scientists, America's partisanship that we now experience really began in Vietnam. So allow me to explain. So poor blue-collar folks, right? Financially poor, blue-collar, factory worker, blue-collar folks, as well as folks from the inner city, and the countryside and the deep South were the most likely to get drafted. So if you were poor, you were likely to end up in Vietnam. If you were poor and you didn't go to college, you were very likely to get drafted. Whereas academic exemptions meant that degree earners, aka those who had enough money and enough school connections and smarts to be in college, were more likely to be excused. And this, now, I also mentioned that students made up a big portion of the protesters, and this produced a very differing lens. People at the time and now have a very different perception of what these protests were, right? So for those in university, they saw the anti-war movement as them standing up for the lives of people their age, their friends and peers, right? To them protesting the war, even though they weren't personally eligible for the draft, was them trying to stand up for the oppressed guy, in their opinion, right? Look, their position was, look, there are people my age, maybe even friends and peers, that are being drafted into this war, that are fighting and dying, and I don't think it's okay, and I'm going to say something about it. On the flip side, to the families of servicemen, the protesters were ungrateful and disrespectful. After all, they were protected from serving in the war, and here they are criticizing those over there serving in Vietnam. If this was happening nowadays, we might be tempted to use the word privilege, right? They're privileged, right? They are exempt. This is not a danger that is going to affect them. Yet here they are faulting the war, and many felt faulting the soldiers who were over there. And so that was a major divide. And people, that continues to divide liberals and conservatives. If you ask even many liberals to this day about the protests, they would see the protesters as being in solidarity with the servicemen who were drafted. To ask many conservatives, they were spitting in the face of the servicemen who were drafted. But the divide goes beyond more than just the rose-tinted glasses through which we often view the past. It also has produced a lot of our politics. See, those in university, because there were university exemptions, they tended to stay in university. So a lot of them didn't, and because college was cheap back then, people didn't just earn associate's degrees. They earned bachelor's degrees. They earned master's degrees. Many of them went on to earn PhDs, right? Because after all, while I'm in college earning my degree, I can't be drafted. So, well, going for that master's, going for that doctorate. So they tended to leave the war, that period, with never serving, with a lot of book knowledge. And many of them went on to become the stereotypical wealthy liberals. When we talk about the proverbial Connecticut liberal kind of image, this is where they come from, right? These are the folks, because they would do very well in the economy. They had all the degrees. And most of them came out of this very liberal. Those who fought in the war came home to a less than gracious reception, many people calling them baby killers and things like that, and often struggled with a return to civilian life. Despite there being GI opportunities through the GI Bill, many of them did not receive a formal education beyond high school. Many of them simply went back to work in the gradually disappearing factory jobs. And many of them would lay the groundwork for the conservative movement that would come about in these years. You know, now the conservative life would soon experience a resurgence. For the past few weeks, we've been talking about a liberal thrust from the civil rights movement to the gay liberation movement to the hippie movement. But society is not on a linear path. It is a pendulum of politics. And any pendulum that swings to the left will eventually swing back to the right. And we begin to see that in a conservative resurgence. Now, that resurgence will not bear political fruit until the election of Ronald Reagan. But we do get to see it begin right here. 1, resistance to the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. 2, the reorganization of the NRA, the National Rifle Organization. And 3, the frustration with stagflation. So let's talk about the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. So what was it? So in the 1970s, at the height of second wave feminism, at the height of the women's liberation movement, we see a move towards the ERA, aka the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have forbidden any kind of discrimination on the basis of sex, biological sex. It was overwhelmingly supported in the Senate. And like any constitutional amendment, it was then passed on to the states for ratification. And here it would die in political limbo. And this failure was due in large part to a conservative campaign against the measure. So why? Why did many people despise the amendment? Well, first of all, it had the unlucky timing of coming out during the Vietnam War. See, right now, under current U.S. law, the Selective Service Act aka the draft, only applies to young men. So if you are a man between the ages of 8 and 20, I mean, not 8, 18 and 25, you are eligible for the draft. Young women of the same age are not eligible. They are perfectly at liberty to enlist in the armed forces if it is their desire, but they are not obligated to in the event of a war. So many in the 70s instantly were terrified that the ERA would mean that since law couldn't discriminate, that young women as well as young men would now be eligible for the draft. With the war in Vietnam, that was a very real threat. So for many women, it was simply a question of sacrificing a little bit of liberty to gain some temporary safety. Now, of course, we all remember, as Ben Franklin famously said, those who would sacrifice liberty in order to earn temporary safety deserve neither and will ultimately lose both. But Ben Franklin wasn't around in the 70s to give us this advice, and we tended to forget his words. But there was more than just trying to get out of the draft. There was another concern. Many women felt the amendment did not respect the life they had chosen as traditional wives and mothers. This was a major objection many had to second wave feminism. See, for many women who had made the decision to choose family life felt that the way people in the feminist movement were talking about being forced into being a wife and a mother and everything, as if they were treating it like it was a less than position, that it wasn't an honorable post. And for many women who were excited to be housewives, were excited to be mothers, they felt like this was a slap in the face. Why are you disrespecting me and the life I've chosen? And so, because of that, many of them rallied against the ERA. Others felt it would overturn the quote unquote biblical family. There were many passages in the King James Version of the Bible, the most common one among American Protestants and thus American evangelicals and their power in politics, was referred to the wife submitting to the husband. And while other biblical translations sometimes translate that the same, sometimes translate it differently, for many Americans, they took that as this is the biblical definition of family. And they took the ERA as being anti-family and anti-Bible. And we're having none of it. This began grassroots conservative activism, especially among white suburban women. So for a lot of white suburban women who really had not taken an interest in politics previously, this was kind of their foray into activism. But it wasn't liberal activism, it was conservative activism. And then we got to talk about a real juggernaut, the non-infringement version of the NRA. So if you've watched a news story at any point in the last 10 to 15 years, you've probably heard someone either celebrating or bemoaning the fact that the NRA is against almost any and all regulation on firearms, on anything that would infringe upon someone's Second Amendment right. And again, you either love them for this or you hate them for this, but this is their reputation. Or you're someone who says they're not doing enough of it. You're probably supporting the Firearm Policy Coalition or something like that. Anywho, or another 2A group. I'm not sure how many there are right now. Anywho, National Rifle Association is a rather old organization, and it was originally started by veterans of the Civil War, by Union veterans who had seen the need for marksmanship in war and had wanted to cultivate a marksman skill and marksman culture among civilians. And so they started the National Rifle Association. And it was kind of originally a mild-mannered club for huntsmen and marksmen. In fact, at one point, even as late as the 40s, the NRA actually advocated general gun licensing, even for rifles. So what changed? When did the NRA go from we're just here to practice hunting and shooting, and you can license them as much as you want, Congress, to, you'll have to take this gun from my cold, dead hands? When did that change? And why did it change? So that change, sorry about that. I've been talking for a while. Came largely as a result of the Nixon administration. Well, actually, the story starts a little earlier with the Mulford Act. So back during period of the Black Panthers, late 1960s, the state of California passed the Mulford Act, as you all know, which banned the open carry of loaded guns in public in the state of California. This was done to take away the ability of the Black Panthers to cop watch, to intimidate, or otherwise manage local police in an armed way. And this was supported by many Republicans in California, including Ronald Reagan. Now, right, as if we need any more proof that the 60s and 70s were an odd time. We had Reagan restricting guns. We had Biden restricting busing, desegregation busing. It was a different time. It really was a different time in American politics. Sorry, that's my pun for today. Anywho, so it was the 60s, man. Okay, I'm done. So Nixon actually thought it was a wonderful idea, and many people in Congress began talking about a national Mulford Act, about banning open carry of guns and other gun type restrictions at a national level. And this was in addition to instituting a lot of things. Nixon would lay a lot of the groundwork for a lot of the stuff we're now dealing with, besides the war on drugs we already talked about. He would also be the one to institute the no-knock warrant, which was done to help the war on drugs by giving police the ability to get a warrant that would not require them to notify anyone that they're coming into your home. Nixon was pro-police and pro-government in a manner alien even to later Republicans. Now, this led to, when the NRA, when this news hit the backcountry and a lot more places, the rural South, the rural West, where guns were a much bigger part of people's lives, there was basically an internal coup within the NRA, whereby the current board of directors at the time was voted out and a new board was voted in. And at this point, the NRA became very pro-Second Amendment. They were opposed to any and all infringement on the Second Amendment. That became their sort of line in the sand. Eventually, even strong-arming the Republican Party into doing the same. You'll notice Nixon's reaction to the Panthers in the 60s, Reagan's reaction to the Panthers in the 60s with passing the Mulford Act when he's in California is actually a much harder gun crackdown than what we see as a reaction, as anything we see regarding handguns, even after Reagan himself gets shot. And it's very possible that may have been the result of a political reality where it was understood that the NRA was not going to allow additional regulation of firearms. So that's an interesting thing. But that happens in the 70s, This is a big part of the conservative resurgence. Stagflation. So the policy of government and industry cooperation, the general unionization and regulation that had been so popular from the 40s up through then begins to break down in the 70s. And this leads advocates of free market to blame unions and regulatory agencies for the shutdown. This is the beginning of this idea that unionization and regulation will kill jobs, right? If you had someone in the 60s, that wasn't the case. Or in the 50s. No, it was unions are good. They give you your rights. Union and corporate cooperation, just the way we do things to make everyone make more money. Beginning in the 70s onward, this is when we hear talk about the unions are a problem. They're keeping bad workers on the assembly line. Regulation's the problem. It's making it too difficult for people to do business. That's when that becomes part of the political lexicon. And finally, we have Roe v. Wade, the ultimate cultural schism. The year is 1973, and the Supreme Court decided to pass a case that legalized abortion in all 50 states. Now, Roe v. Wade was a complete disaster from start to finish. Now, the case was the state's attorney at the time was Texas attorney Everett Wade, who famously lost in absolute spectacular fashion. I mean, the burning of the Hindenburg seemed like a graceful exit compared to Everett Wade. So Wade was representing the state on a law that had been allowed for decades. Seemed an easy thing. And then he made the mistake. Supreme Court asked him on what basis he justified the state's opposition to abortion. And Wade states the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. Now, the reason I'm stating this is not in this manner is not out of any particular disrespect to the Declaration, but because the Declaration of Independence is not a legally binding document. It is an ideological document. It gives us a window into the mind of the framers, much the same way as the Federalist Papers do. And it provided the reasons why America was formed and why we broke away from the British, but it is not a legally binding document. And so because it is not a legally binding document, none of those things were guaranteed as laws. And this is a basic understanding of civics that we expect you guys, all of you as high school students, to understand. But here we have a man who is the Attorney General of the state of Texas. I believe he was Attorney General or Assistant Attorney General at the time. This is someone you would expect to know better. He didn't. This basically left Everett Wade scrambling because he had not prepared anything beyond this. He had no evidence of, when the Supreme Court asked if there was evidence of an unborn child being regarded as, as a person in other legal precedents. He had none. And they couldn't find any in common law, which played very well to his opposition. And basically Wade was floundering because he didn't expect to have to argue this well. And meanwhile, the opposition was kind of shocked it was this easy. And this kind of allowed them to ride roughshod over Wade. And the Supreme Court ultimately ruled abortion legal based upon the 9th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. And it was often hailed as a triumph for second wave feminism, i.e. the women's liberation movement, the move to which is the second, right? First wave feminism is the suffragettes, is women's voting. Second wave feminism is all about expanding women's rights in society, equal position in the workplace, women's right to their own body, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this was maligned by religious groups as the destruction of thousands upon thousands of innocent lives. Remember, if you consider a fetus to be an unborn child, to be a human being, then every abortion in the nation is infanticide, is murder. If you don't, then it's just a medical procedure. Some religious individuals responded with attacks on abortion clinics. Others with costly legal battles as states attempted to limit abortion. Now, remember how earlier on I said there was a cult problem? It's back. So I'd like to now introduce you all to the People's Temple. This is, see, in abortion, we don't agree. Are kids dying? Are they not dying? Society doesn't agree. In People's Temple, it's obvious. There were kids, and they're dead now. So what happened? This is a cult run by a man named Jim Jones, and Jones preached a racially integrated progressive doctrine while also insisting on complete control over temple members' lives. And he became a powerful force in California where numerous politicians sought him out. So he was kind of the archetype of the successful kind of mega preacher. And Eventually, he lamented that he didn't have enough control over his followers, so he convinced them to move to a model community he was starting in the tiny South American nation of Guyana. And at this point, he set up a model community known as Jonestown. And later on, a U.S. congressman was asked by the families of some of the cultists to visit and make sure everything was going okay. Fearful of what the congressman was going to report back, Jim Jones had the congressman shot. Fearing U.S. reprisals for the death of the congressman, he orchestrated a murder-suicide of his cult in 1978. The members prepared a poisoned punch, which the members drank. The fruit punch laced with cyanide, killing everyone in the cult in a mass suicide. Those who didn't drink it were shot. This is also for some reason, though the drink was actually not Kool-Aid, it was reported as Kool-Aid. This is the origin of the popular phrase when referring to someone succumbing to a cult or conspiracy theory mindset, is why people say, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Or when someone does fall for saying, oh, he or she drank the Kool-Aid. Right? You'll often hear that reference sometime. Don't drink the Kool-Aid, man. Or, he drank the Kool-Aid. Disco. So this is the nightclub scene of the late 70s and early 1980s, known for line dances, to the left, to the left. Okay. Where this is the beginning of the club scene, modern club scene in many ways. And clothing tended to be extreme. Heck, style tended to be extreme, right? People really were very flamboyant. Clothing tended to be out there. Bright white suits and blue suits made of velour and silk and vinyl, these kind of shiny, flashy fabrics. Many men would wear the upper 2 to 3 buttons of their shirt wide open. People wore scarves and ascots. African-American men tended to have very large afros. I'm talking afros at least the size of your head, probably considerably larger. Even, in fact, in some discos, even white folk took to wearing the afros. And in major cities, we also saw the rise of discos where cocaine became an active part of the disco experience to extend the energy of the participants and extend the party, similar to the use of ecstasy in modern raves. Now, while disco would eventually die, we would soon see a rise of another genre, hip-hop. So on the tail end of the 1970s, hip-hop began to develop. Now, it was mostly a grassroots urban phenomenon among African Americans. And the style wouldn't become mainstream until the 1980s and 1990s. The 1970s would end with a bang, right? While the decade began with American students held gunpoint at Kent State, it would end with American diplomats being held gunpoint in Tehran. So this is the Iranian hostage crisis. So prior to this event, Iran had shahs or kings for much of their recent history. And Reza Shah ruled until 1941 when the Allied powers compelled his abdication. Reza Shah was a pro-Axis gentleman. In fact, he greatly admired Hitler and is even responsible for changing the kingdom's name from Persia to Iran, meaning literally land of the Aryans. This is basically akin to him screaming, "We're white! Notice us that we're white!" I'm sorry. I enjoy making fun of Iran for that. Not in general making fun of Iranians, but this was bad behavior and needs to be mocked. So Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was appointed as his father's successor by the Allies. He was pro-modernization and pro-US. And this man would reign until the end of the Kingdom of Iran. In January of 1979, see, the Shah was out in the US seeking medical treatment for, I believe it was cancer at the time. And while he was gone, see, in his effort to modernize, the Shah had exiled an Iranian cleric known as the Ayatollah. And while the Shah was absent, Saeed Ruhollah Musavi Khomeini, also known as the Ayatollah Khomeini, returned from exile. During this revolution, Iran was declared as a theocracy, an Islamic republic. It would no longer be a monarchy. It would no longer be ruled by a king. It would be ruled by an elected government. But ultimately, the country's legal tradition would be rooted in Islamic Sharia law, not in previous legal developments of the Kingdom of Iran. Now, by November, student protesters in Iran took the U.S. embassy hostage. Iran held American hostages as protest of the U.S. refusing to hand the Shah over to the Iranian government. Resolving the crisis, President Carter attempted to negotiate a release using humanitarian appeals and economic pressure. Iran did not capitulate until the Iran-Iraq War decreased Iran's power. Iran would end up in war with its neighbor, Iraq, at the time led by the dictator Saddam Hussein. On January of 1981, the hostages were finally freed. So what are the repercussions? This would be the beginning of tense Iranian-American relations. Iran would come to regard America as its arch nemesis in the world, and America would fundamentally regard Iran as a threat. President Carter, for his unwillingness to use military force against Iran, would be regarded as weak. And this would lead the public to rally around Carter's rival in the election, a former California governor, former actor by the name of Ronald Reagan. And that is where we end our discussion on the 70s, everybody. Groovy, man.